Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 3, Henry Pelham, the Prime Administrator. He was Prime Minister between 1743 and 1754. Hello everyone and welcome to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, and this is the 39th Prime Minister we've covered in this series. But, in an interesting twist, this is actually the 3rd Prime Minister in chronological order. And a lot of prime ministerial water has gone under Random UK Prime Minister of the Week's bridge in that time. So even though we're only on Prime Minister 3, some patterns have emerged, and by the time this episode is complete, we'll have completed a run of the first 8 Prime Ministers. So they're all there if you want to go back and have a listen to the early history of Prime Ministers in the UK. And apologies here, but we're going to use a metaphor, I'm sorry. If we see Robert Walpole as the first album, well, that one was a huge success, topping the charts for over 2 decades, and even defining a whole genre of music, the Prime Minister. However, when his premiership came to an end, we didn't know if his success was just a one-off or not. Could the next Prime Minister have the same success? Was it even possible to have such rampant success as Robert Walpole had done? Well, the signs weren't good when Prime Minister number 2 came along. The album, called Spencer Compton, seemed essentially to be a rehash of the same old tunes, not willing, not able to move in a new direction. So this wasn't a good sign for this new genre of music. That was the tricky second album of this metaphor, however, but what of the even trickier, particularly in these circumstances, third album? This is always the one that tests a band. Was it, at the end of the day, a one-hit wonder followed by a blip? Or is this a band that will run and run and run? Well, in terms of Prime Ministers, we know the answer to that. But what was the fresh idea that led to this institution having another hit after that second tricky album? How about a bloated double album? It's always a good idea for any band casting around for ideas. And in prime ministerial terms, we have Henry Pelham, who was followed by his own brother. Henry Pelham's actually one of the longest serving prime ministers ever. Even though he's not one of the more famous ones, it's the 8th longest serving at just over 10 years, narrowly beaten by Margaret Thatcher. But even his brother who followed him was there for a reasonably long time at 7.5 years. So together this double album, the Pelham brothers, were Prime Minister for almost 2 decades. And if we take those terms together, it does add up to one of the longest premierships ever. Although of course there were 2 brothers involved here. And it is strange that Pelham seems to be one of the most significant surnames in British history that's been forgotten by British history. We said in our episode about Henry Campbell Bannerman that if you ever need the name of an obscure 20th century Prime Minister for a quiz, for example, remember Henry Campbell Bannerman. No one else will, but he's an interesting Prime Minister to look up his episode. For Henry Pelham, on the other hand, we might grant the title of the most important forgotten Prime Minister ever, at least if we go on the length of his tenure. So if you want the name of a really, really obscure Prime Minister, who nevertheless was quite important in the history of the country, remember this one, Henry Pelham. The name of his brother, that man who followed him as Prime Minister, is better known by his title, the Duke of Newcastle, than by his name, and his surname was actually double-barrelled due to inheritance, Pelham Halls, so perhaps that's why Pelham isn't such a famous surname. What was Henry Pelham like? We were hoping to say that Henry Pelham, as this important metaphorical third album, consolidated the role of Prime Minister because he was wildly talented and brought a unique ability to the role that transformed the country for the better. However, the reality is much less inspirational actually. Henry Pelham seems to have been a solid administrator, a good manager, which was actually all that was wanted from the role of Prime Minister at that time. Essentially, at that point in history, Prime Ministers were just leaders in lieu of the King, a sort of King's deputy. The King in this case being George II, who was by all accounts more German than English, which was why Parliament had become increasingly important during those years. Frankly, it's arguable whether the 2 first Georges were actually very interested in the country they were ruling. Now, the reason why Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister, had succeeded in this particular version of the role for 20 years was because ultimately he was adept at keeping the right people happy. And it seems that Henry Pelham lasted over 10 years in the same job because of the same reasons. George II seemed to be happy with him, so there was no need for him to change. Not much of a personality emerges in the biographies we've read, with descriptions being something like experienced manager and good at dealing with finances. Other commentators point out that if he'd had a stronger, more controversial personality, he wouldn't have been able to keep the various factions he was dealing with on his side. He's also been called a clever and considered man, and although he has been described as a quiet man, relatively honest, with a firm will, this could also be the most positive thing you can say about someone without much personality at all, really, who just knew how to keep the king and his friends on his side. He married his wife, Catherine Manners, in 1726 and had 4 surviving children with her. What was the historical background? Pelham was Prime Minister in the mid-1700s, between 1743 and 1754. And the War of the Austrian Succession was the main event during those times. That took place between 1740 and 1748, when Britain joined forces with the Dutch and Hanover against the Prussians, the French and the Bavarians, fighting over who would rule much of Europe after the death of the Habsburg king Charles VI. Although the war ended in 1748, there weren't really any clear winners, and this war eventually led to another one, the 7 Years' War, which started in 1756. One interesting note is that George II, King of England at the time, commanded the troops in the Battle of Dettingen in this war, this being the last time that a monarch guided the military in this way. So this War of Austrian Succession involved the various nations of Europe picking sides, and so it was played out on many fronts, another one being in the Caribbean, specifically taking place between Britain and Spain over who controlled the various territories there. This branch of the war began when Robert Jenkins, a British captain, had his ear cut off by the Spanish off the coast of Florida. The resulting war was called the War of Jenkins' Ear, and it took place between 1739 and 1748, with Spain eventually more or less successfully defending its American territories against the British. Closer to home, in Great Britain during Pelham's tenure, there was another of those repeated threats to the rule of the Hanoverians in the early part of the 1700s. The 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, when the Catholic pretender to the throne, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, attempted to assert his claim to the throne over George II, was definitively crushed, to all intents and purposes ending the Jacobite cause once and for all. The Georges were finally firmly established. In the background, however, many people were unhappy. When Walpole's tenure ended as Prime Minister, people expected big changes in politics. In particular, the Whig grouping had been in power during all that time, and the Tories, a more nebulous political grouping in those days, were chomping at the bit to have more of a say. However, Spencer Compton, Prime Minister number 2, just continued with the same politics. And even Pelham was actually harking back to the same old guard, keeping George II happy. Even the Whigs themselves at this time, however, weren't a united force. The old boys' club breaking apart. And to some extent it was this air of dissatisfaction that actually led to this 1745 Jacobite rebellion. The need for change was building, and the establishment was fighting back. What was happening in the United States at the time? Of course, this was before the 13 colonies declared their independence, but we can see how these controversies back in England would have influenced the people in the colonies. They were also increasingly unhappy with being ruled from a distant island. The War of the Austrian Succession also played out on the North American mainland, particularly between New France, today's Canada, and colonies in today's New England. However, the people of the colonies called it King George's War, perhaps rather dismissively, saying it was the war of a distant king. Who could vote in those days? Aristocrats and the landed gentry were the only people who had their say in those days. But we've already said that these issues were bubbling under. The Whig grouping, which represented industrialists and new money, had been in power for decades, and the Tories, who represented the older money, the aristocrats, they wanted their say. They wouldn't get any more say with Pelham or his brother, and then the first Tory Prime Minister would only come along when a new king inherited the throne in 1760, and he all but gave the job to John Stuart, the Earl of Bute, the first Tory to take the job and a very unpopular Prime Minister. What was Henry Pelham's background? The sources we've looked at actually state different dates for Henry Pelham's birth. The majority say 1694 was the year he was born, but one quite authoritative source does say that he was born in 1696. One thing we know for certain, however, was that he was the younger of the two Pelham brothers to become Prime Minister. Perhaps counterintuitively, it was specifically because he was the younger brother of the Pelham family that he became Prime Minister before his older brother. He had a typical establishment education of the time, going to one of the establishment's favourite schools, Westminster. 7 Prime Ministers have gone there. And then going on to both Cambridge University and Oxford University. How about that? He's the only Prime Minister to have gone to both of the establishment's favourite universities. Now, we've mentioned the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, but during another of these rebellions in 1715, he volunteered to join the army, fighting in the last major conflict of the war, in the Battle of Preston. In 1717, he became an MP for the first time, with the help of his brother. So we can see that his older brother inherited his father's title, the Duke of Newcastle, and became a very powerful man. But with all these responsibilities, he didn't want to become a politician. His younger brother, on the other hand, was looking for something to do, so the older brother used all his connections to give his younger brother the leg up, and this is why Henry Pelham became Prime Minister despite being the younger brother of the Duke of Newcastle. Both brothers, actually, were at the top of politics during Walpole's tenure. Walpole made Henry Pelham Lord of the Treasury in 1721 and then moved him into other roles such as Secretary of War and Paymaster of the Forces. So how did Henry Pelham become Prime Minister? Well, his brother had given him a leg up into politics and he'd made allies with the most powerful man in the country, Robert Walpole. When Spencer Compton died, therefore, Henry Pelham had 2 powerful establishment allies on his side. He was even related to one of them. Despite many people seeming to clamour for change after the departure of Walpole, the old guard was clinging on. George II did have another favourite for the role, in the guise of a man called Carteret, who was apparently much more experienced in international issues than Henry Pelham, speaking foreign languages, for example. However, Pelham got the job due to his trump card, his brother, and thanks to the general lack of interest in that war of Austrian succession by the people. It meant that any victories that the King and Carteret had internationally weren't gaining them any patriotic points with the voters. We've seen many times during Random Prime Minister of the Week how a Prime Minister's reputation can soar if they win a war, but in this case, people just weren't interested in this distant war of succession. On the contrary, the King and this Carteret were distracting themselves with these issues, allowing Pelham's influence to increase, to the point where he held enough of those titles of the day, Chancellor of the Exchequer and First Lord of the Treasury, to add up to that of Prime Minister, a title which didn't have any official status at that time. What were Pelham's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? One of the most eye-catching things that happened under his watch was that the calendar was changed. The old calendar was changed on the 20th of March 1751, and then, a year later, the Gregorian calendar was put in place. It's the one we still use today. Pelham's main success over his decade in power seems to have been to reform the economy and reduce the national debt. The War of the Austrian Succession came to an end in 1748, which in itself considerably improved the nation's finances. There are other details, such as he legalised the ability of Jews to get married and to become naturalised citizens of the country. Other than that, though, he just seems to have been a man who didn't ruffle the establishment too much. Why did Henry Pelham stop being Prime Minister? Well, the answer to this one is short. He died in office. He was only the third Prime Minister, and he was the second of those three to die in the job. And his brother was already at the top of politics, and it seems that he more or less inherited the title without much fuss. He was, however, a less stable figure than his brother, so apparently he was less naturally prime ministerial, at least in the terms required in those days. Why should we remember Henry Pelham? It really is curious that Pelham and the Pelham name isn't more famous, but then the wars at the time were complicated and messy. There wasn't a clear winner in the War of the Austrian Succession. Rather, it just seemed that bits of land were shuffled here and there. The role of Prime Minister itself relied on being a favourite of the King, which isn't exactly the most distinguished reason for getting a job, but it was something that he seemed to do well. Perhaps, however, he could have been called the Prime Administrator in that sense, just keeping the country running smoothly enough to keep on holding the job, keeping the old guard in power until his own death and his replacement by his brother. Thank you for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week by Long History. I hope you enjoyed that, and please do give it a like if you did like it and share it with anyone who might be interested. Your help would be much appreciated there. As we said at the beginning, this is the 39th Prime Minister we've looked at in this series, so there's plenty to explore if you want to have a look around your podcast provider. We've now covered every period in prime ministerial history, even if we haven't actually covered every Prime Minister. All our podcast episodes are also available on our website, longhistory.net. Above all, thank you for listening, everyone. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 3, Henry Pelham, the Prime Administrator. Goodbye.